Lastly, we will recognize the 40th recipient of the Topaz Medallion for Excellence in Architectural Education, a joint award given by the ACSA and the AIA. We are proud to join with the AIA in giving this award, and I would like to invite Elizabeth Chu Richter, FAIA AIA President, up to the stage to join Ming in presenting the medallion. The Topaz Medallion is the highest award given to architectural educators. It honors an individual who has made outstanding contributions to architectural education and who's influenced the minds of students who will shape our environment. It is presented both here at the ACSA annual meeting and at the upcoming AIA convention in Atlanta.
Greetings from the 85,000 members of the AIA. It's great to be here. And it is my great pleasure to be able to present the Topaz Medallion this year to Peter Eisenman, FAIA. Peter Eisenman has been a visiting critic and professor at nearly a dozen schools across the nation and has lectured at countless more. Throughout his career, Eisenman has been celebrated for his writings, his research, and his scholarship, as well as commitment to teaching. He's primarily known for his long association with Princeton, Harvard, Cooper Union, and Yale, where he has been a professor, full-time professor since 2005. By working with these schools of architecture, Eisenman has operated much more like a public intellectual than a workaday professor. He draws from many fields outside of the School of Architecture, and he draws from areas like linguistics, philosophy, art, and psychoanalysts. And to quote Dean Tom Fisher, he said, "Raise the intellectual credibility of our field." So Peter, would you mind joining us up here while we congratulate you for receiving the 2015 AIA ACSA Topaz Medallion?
Thank you, Elizabeth. We would like to invite George Baird, 2012 Topaz Laureate, up to the stage.
ACSA colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to be back with you again. I had many enjoyable years, especially 5 on the board several years ago, and then that was all topped off by my being awarded the Topaz Medallion myself. As a number of you in this room are aware, I was fortunate enough to be selected as the winner of the Topaz Medallion of ACSA and the AIA in 2012. I expect that some of you may have been in the room in the Park Plaza Hotel in Boston, the same room Richard Sommer was just talking about, where I delivered my acceptance speech. You may remember the image. Can I have the first slide, please? We're having a rather unusual kind of reversal of roles between Peter Eisenman and myself this evening. I'm only introducing him, but I'm the one with the slides. He's only going to talk to you, or so I'm told. Any event, there's the image. The image shows me as a much younger George Baird sitting in a seminar at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies sometime in the early to mid-1970s. Maybe Peter could make a more precise estimate of the exact time. And those of you who were present in Boston will remember me adding spontaneously to my prepared remarks when the image came up on the screen, now that I think of it, why hasn't Peter Eisenman, that's him, of course, a little bit younger himself in the photograph sitting beside me, why hasn't he received the Topaz Medallion? He has had far more influence on American architectural education than I have done. Reflecting afterward on that moment in my speech, I decided that there was no reason that I myself shouldn't mount a nomination of Peter for the Topaz. And I can tell you that for the past 3 years, successively, I, together with a number of ACSA colleagues, have been engaged in a project of nomination of him for the medallion. I must confess I hadn't expected the Eisenman nomination to be as controversial as it turned out. Evidently, I have significantly fewer critics in ACSA than he does. And even I would admit that he isn't exactly an ACSA kind of guy. But the Topaz isn't given for being such a guy or gal. It is given for excellence in architectural education. Moreover, I would note that the first Topaz Medallion winner I saw receive it, again, we're back to Vancouver, was Colin Rowe in Vancouver in 1985. And I don't think it could be said that Rowe was an ACSA kind of guy either. Well, all that being as it may, I am pleased to report that Eisenman called me in mid-December to let me know that our campaign this year had been successful and that he had received the fateful telephone call to inform him that he was the Topaz winner for 2015. I could not have been happier to receive such news. Now, I would like to say also that it is my sense that Eisenman's personal practice has been more controversial even than his activities in architectural education. Indeed, I myself have profound reservations in regard to the form of his practice activities over the years, which he knows. This is no secret. I think it is fair to say that he and I share, to some degree, an intellectual lineage derived from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. But somehow Eisenman has always supposed that intellectual loyalty to that tradition, or to that lineage, necessitates a radically avant-gardist professional stance. Whereas for me, following from another of our shared intellectual influences, Manfredo Taufuri, to adopt such an avant-gardist stance was simply an intellectual red herring, irrelevant at best and damaging at worst. But again, the Topaz is not given for practice. It is given for pedagogy. And just to show how distinct Eisenman's pedagogy has been from his practice, let me point out to you that the most savage and compelling critique of the avant-garde in architecture that I have ever read is Giorgio Grassi's scorching commentary, Avant-Garde and Continuity. And where did I read it? I did so in issue number 22 of the journal Oppositions, of which Eisenman was a founding editor and which was published out of his legendary Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. So his pedagogy has always been far more ecumenical than his practice. And this is to mention what I see as his two seminal contributions to American architectural education: the founding of the Institute and his establishment of Oppositions. It is these activities, as I see it, that argue for him as perhaps the most influential architectural educator of his generation. I should say that I'm older than most of you in the room, and so I was in my late 20s, in the late 60s. And those of you that are young enough not to be able to remember those years will have no idea of the electrifying impact of the arrival of the Institute and of the journal Oppositions on our field. It was truly, for people in my generation, it was truly transformational. All this leads me to my concluding remarks. I now show an image, can I have the next slide, please? Of the first publication of Eisenman that I ever saw. This is his dissertation from Cambridge University from 1963, first shown to me in a loose typescript copy by Christopher Cornford in Cambridge sometime in 1965 or 66. Here we see Eisenman for the first time developing the methods of formal analysis that made him famous, and doing so not only with such obvious choices of architects as Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, but also with such lesser studied figures, at that time at least, as Alvar Aalto and Giuseppe Torragni. So as I see it, Eisenman's architectural interests have always been far more diverse than it has been supposed. To show only a late example, next slide please, here is the cover of one of his more recent publications, which discusses in considerable detail individual works of 10 architects, 10 different architects, from the heroic period of modernism through to the present. Finally, let me report to you that I learned in a recent conversation with my former Harvard colleague, Michelle Addington, who is with us here tonight, and who is now a colleague and friend of Eisenman's at Yale, that she and he have even become, are now not only friends, but even occasional collaborators. And as many of you are aware, Professor Addington's area of pedagogical expertise is sustainability, and I suspect that you will be as interested as I was to learn from her that, among other things, she and Eisenman have discussions together of architectural sustainability. Now, I will bet that the skeptics of the Eisenman nomination among you will not have expected that particular piece of information. May I even venture to say that Eisenman may turn out to be an ACSA kind of guy after all. Colleagues, I ask you to join me in welcoming to the rostrum the 2015 winner of the Topaz Medallion for Excellence in Architectural Education, Peter Eisenman.
Could we get the house lights up? We had them up a little bit before. Can we get the house lights up? I'd just like to see who's out there. There are probably 10 introductions that I have to make. First of all, I want to say I'm here as a teacher architect, and therefore I'm not showing any slides of my work, number one, nor of my students' work. So that should go without saying. Second, I want to thank George and all those people who struggled, I think it was more than 3 times, to try and work this thing out. I'm never sure why the blockage, but I think, as I said to George the day I called him, we outlasted them. The last time I remember talking to Cynthia Davidson, my wife, and saying, I don't want to do this again. I said, I think it would be better to go down in history as never having gotten the Topaz than to get it. And several of my strange colleagues agreed with me at the time. Now that we've got it, I can't say anything but I'm really honored and happy, and I really think I belong up here. Because I do love teaching, and I believe that I can say I do have one distinguishing characteristic. I am the longest consecutive teaching architect alive today. That is, I started, thank you. which I started in 1960. If anybody in this room said they started before 1960 and continued, I'd love to know about it so that I wouldn't tread on their heels. I want to say that in response to George, if I was on a desert island and I had 10 books to take with me, one of them would be Meaning in Architecture by George and Charles Jenks. And for all of you students who have never read it or never even thought about it, there are used bookshops all over this town. Go and get a copy. Not just because George introduced me, because it's a fabulous book, a book that I read over and over again, and also in its time, it was revolutionary. So, George, hats off. And the final thing I want to say is how he soft-pedaled nicely the sustainability gig. And Michelle is here. I will further embarrass her. We did a competition together. And Michelle Addington said to me, and I have it recorded at the time, I kept saying, come on, Michelle, give us something that looks like sustainability, right? And she said, you know, that's really funny for you, that you want some formal determinants. There are no formal determinants with sustainability. And I said, I knew there was a problem, right? So all of you students who are looking to do projects that look sustainable, according to Michelle Addington, it ain't possible. Which leads me to where I want to be tonight. I did prepare a few notes and on a subject which I think is about where education of architects may be or should be today. The title of these few notes is Originality and Authority. Sometime early last semester, I posed a rhetorical question to my first year MArch 1 theory class at Yale as to what they thought they were supposed to learn at Yale. One woman out of the 53 students, and there were more than one woman, but she raised her hand, which is important in this context, I think. And upon being recognized, she confidently said, we are learning about originality, on how to be original. And I was stunned by this pronouncement. And without thinking of how it might affect this student or the rest of the students in the class, I replied, Madam, in the land of the unknowing, originality is king, which I still think is possibly true. And then I said, where does such a thought about originality come from? And where there may be many different and often valid views on what constitutes an architectural curriculum today, from global culture to sustainability, from object-oriented ontology to parametricism, originality would not be one of these curricula, nor a pedagogy. The question of originality reminds me of a moment in time when I was a sophomore in the early 1950s at Cornell School of Architecture. And I had Paul Rudolph as a critic. And Paul was there for, I guess, the first semester of might have been my third year, 52. Anyway, we were given a project that I quickly turned to my Frank Lloyd Wright book sitting close at hand, and I did a Frank Lloyd Wright project. And these were closed juries at that time, as were most Beaux-Arts schools. And we all waited anxiously outside the door to find out how we did. And they opened the doors, and I went in, and there I had a first mention. And I thought, because I had done Frank Lloyd Wright, and I thought, oh my God, I was so excited, and that, you know, I thought Paul Rudolph had recognized me. It was one of the 2 or 3 first mentions in the class. And so we were given the next project the next semester, and it was a yacht club. And even though Paul wasn't coming back, I remembered in my Frank Lloyd Wright book, there was the Yahara Boat Club. And quickly, not knowing that no one else would have known the Yahara Boat Club, I sketched over it, put it on my paper, you know, rendered it up, put it up, and then to my enormously excited young mind, I found out that Paul was coming back to be on the jury after I had decided to do the Yahara Boat Club. And I was really excited. And I waited knowing that I was in great shape for the jury to open. And I walked in, and there was a big X, which meant, we called it a chop, but it meant I had to go to summer school to make up the term. And I went up to Mr. Rudolph. I said, Mr. Rudolph, why was that? And he said, young man, he said, you can copy once, but not twice. And that stuck with me, has stuck with me for a long time. The question of originality reminds me also of Jacques Derrida's discussion of the copy and the original, where he says that every copy at some point becomes a new original. The entire tradition, I could argue, of 20th century European philosophy has been based on philosophers using other philosophers as surrogates for their own ideas. Derrida on Husserl or Heidegger, Deleuze on Kant does not diminish either party, but rather creates a context for a new original, Heidegger or Derrida, Deleuze or Kant. My teaching, therefore, has always involved a search for what could be called precedents, what can be called also symbols of disciplinary authority. Thus, my students always spend at least 1/3 of their design time on the analysis of such precedents, whether they're from the Renaissance, from the 19th century, from early modernism, wherever. It has always been my contention that if a student doesn't know the precedents, how can he or she evaluate and become original? There can be no originality without a strong disciplinary authority to stand against it. So while there is a perceived lack of authorial presence in something called big data, which also threatens to be in itself an authorial presence, the digital proposes a panoply of originality rather than authority, which has little value in the critical other than for originality itself. But in the end, there is always an authority figure who needs to choose. If we look at the history of architecture in the United States after World War II, the presence of what can be called symbolic disciplinary authority existed. When I was in school, and I therefore have lived through what I want to say, traces of such an authority, for example, were there in the 1940s, Frank Lloyd Wright. No one would sit with a book of Frank Lloyd Wright on their desk today, but I promise you, in the late 40s and early 50s, we had Wright books. We all were conversant with Wright. It's one of the reasons that Wright appears in my PhD dissertation in '61, because Wright was a figure. And I remember also personally going to his suite in the Plaza Hotel when the Guggenheim was going up, and we sat around on the floor. Frank Lloyd Wright sat in a chair, and his two acolytes standing next to him. It was amazing ritual, right? And the group of us students were sitting in a little circle on the floor, and he was eating gherkin seeds and spitting them on the floor, going like that. It was really an amazing time. And so we said, what kind of word do you have for young architects, Mr. Wright? And Mr. Wright said, here's what I'll tell you. Acorns don't grow under big oaks. And I got the message very clearly. After Wright, there was Le Corbusier and Mies, and the books changed, but the same notion of authority existed that was taken from these books. We had a language, a shorthand language, that we'd be able to do Maison Cook or La Roche. We would know, in the minute we said La Roche, more like La Roche than Cook, everybody would know, the students, the faculty, what we were talking about, and we could talk about the relationship of Cook to La Roche. It was important for the students, it was important for the teachers, because there was an authority such as Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. In the 60s, it turned again to Louis Kahn, and we all knew Kahn's project. I can't believe it, but my submission to the Boston City Hall competition was based on the Richards Medical Building, and the Richards Medical Building in 60 and 61 was a hot item, as were the kinds of projects that were published on Kahn in Perspective magazine, which used to be, in a sense, a magazine of record back in the 60s and 70s. After Kahn, in the 70s, there was Venturi, there was Jim Sterling, there was Aldo Rossi. And you had to be conversant with these authority figures in order to be a young architect. And those are the kind of things that we got together and talked about, the merits of these people. In the 80s, very short-lived, but there was deconstruction because of the exhibition at MoMA. In the 90s, the digital moved in, and we are today in a situation where is the authority, okay? What the authority was something to hit against. You could test yourself against these changing movements of authority. And originality, therefore, was not in the vacuum that it exists in today. Now, what is the problem with authority? Okay? There are two concerns that people have about authority in the world that we are in today, not only within architecture, but without. One concerns authority figures, star architects, etc., as manifestations of power, and the implications of authority and power, which have somehow been conjoined. The second is big data, which is another powerful instrument that is operating in some sort of authorial role. Aldo Rossi was one of the first people in our lifetime, let's say, to recognize this problem of authority. And he tried to overcome the power associated with individual authorial expression by searching for the fixed laws of a timeless typology. And if we look at Aldo in that way, we're going to see that because he faced this questioning, the first questioning of the authorial figure, he began to look at questions of typology. There is a second paradox inherent in what is being said about symbolic authority. On the one hand, there is a call for more authorial presence, with the realization that such a presence also brings with it power. Such an authorial presence provided in the past, a value system by which to judge the value of all works. On the other hand, there is the populist cant against the star architect system and its misuse of power. A similar paradox exists in my support of the need to build and my stance against presence and phenomenology. In this case, it is perhaps more easily reversed if power resides more easily in physical presence than to understand power in physical form, and thus potentially to mitigate its strength is one reason not to build. But if, as Manfredo Tafuri has said, the architect, in order to have his or her thinking validated, must build. And this is always meant to me conceptually to build as opposed to phenomenology. My recent teaching and research concerns how the formal can be used to undercut and resist the received power of global capital. And since the 19th century, where capital became a major source of ideological power as opposed to disciplinary authority, to attempt to unhook architecture from this ideological power might begin to suggest a critical dialogue within the discipline in order to find a different form of authority without overt ideological content. For me, this could be the beginning of a possible pedagogy. Now, I had originally intended to conclude at this moment, but there's something I do want to say and acknowledge. A colleague of mine who passed away this week, and it's very important for me as an old friend of him to recognize the fact that Michael Graves, who was supposed to come as one of my sponsors, passed away a week ago. And Michael is a great example of what I've been talking about today. Because Michael, when I first met him, was a Walter Gropius student at Harvard. And I was a Walter Gropius, or I shouldn't say he was a Walter Gropius student at Harvard. I was the Walter Gropius student at the Architects Collaborative. I was working for Walter Gropius. Michael was working with Jose Luis Sert. And he was a Sert guy. He won a Rome Prize to go to Europe, and he became a Morandi guy. Infatuated with Morandi. In fact, his first house, which is hardly ever published, is Morandi-esque, very different than the two early houses that he published. He came to Princeton and realized that neither Sert nor Morandi were the authority figures he needed at the time, and he switched to Corbu. His signature changed, so he signed things like he was Le Corbusier, right? And he lived the life of Le Corbusier. I remember when we were both having children, and Michael said to my then wife, "You got to have all white clothes for the kid. There can be no bunnies or rabbits or chickens. You got to have white." And after spending a day in New York trying to find all white clothes, impossible, I said, "Michael, I can't do it," right? And he sort of let me off the hook. But Michael couldn't have been more infatuated with the authority of Le Corbusier. But what that did for him, what Sert, Morandi, Le Corbusier, and then go back to Michelangelo from his stay in the American Academy, and Borromini, and Brunelleschi, and Bernini, he learned all of the possible authorities that there were. He knew them backwards and forwards, one of the reasons he was an important teacher. And so, while we think of Michael as one of the early postmodernists, Michael was never really a postmodernist. He became a Midwest original, okay? Out of the voices of authority, he was able to forge an original voice of his own in the Fargo-Moorhead Project, in the Portland in Humana. In many of the early projects, there was a voice that we hadn't seen in architecture before. And I would want to argue not only in his memory, because he was top dog in 1980, but that top dog had moved from authority to originality. And without understanding the nature of the authorial presence and necessary presence in our discipline, I don't think the voice of originality would have ever been released. So I want to say that I think about Michael. We were colleagues together in the big fight for architecture in the 60s when you used to fight for things. I can remember one last anecdote. When Le Corbusier died in August of '65, something that we wouldn't even do for Tom Main today, we stayed up all night with our students, took every issue of the Œuvre Complète, took it apart, and put it on the walls of the gallery at the School of Architecture in Princeton. Every page of the Œuvre Complète layered onto the walls with black crepe X's over it when Le Corbusier died. That kind of energy, almost fanatical observation, elementarist, if you want, fundamentalist, belief in architecture as an art, as a way of being, living and being in the world, is something that I always cherish, that Michael and I together nurtured, and how I will miss that today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was phenomenal. I just want to invite everybody to the awards reception, which is across the hall in the Civic Ballroom. And please feel free to congratulate the winners, take pictures with the winners, and post them on social media with, with the hashtag ACSA103. So thank you again, and congratulations, everybody.